Number 5. Frank Matthews. Our first spot is notorious criminal kingpin Frank Matthews, a legendary crime lord operating out of New York in the 1960s, who also had some pretty cool classic mafia names like Pee-wee and Black Caesar. Built himself a criminal empire that Los Polos Hermanos would have been jealous of. Starting out small, working in racketeering and illegal gambling ops in Philly in the 1960s, he had his sights set on much bigger things, working his way up, collecting numbers, making contacts, until he could start selling product for some serious money. By the early 1970s, he was already trading millions of dollars for illegal narcotics, importing his stuff from Latin America and distributing it throughout the States. Pee-wee had his hands and pockets across the country, with his criminal web spanning across 21 states at its peak. Naturally, if you're moving that much stuff around the country with that many people involved in your operation, eventually somebody's gonna get wise. And that's exactly what happened. Boys in Blue tapped Frankie's phone communications and put out a federal bulletin for his arrest. By December 1972, Frank and his girlfriend were arrested at McCarran International in Vegas. Okay, so he got caught. This kind of breaks the list a little bit, but hear me out a little bit here. Because after spending a paltry couple months in jail, Frankie made bail and quickly got out of Dodge to literally never be seen again. Now, there is some discrepancy as to what happened. The FBI suspects that he was taken care of by a major New York crime family for fears he may turn witness. But they did also post a bounty, a $200,000 bounty for finding him, so they suspected he might still be out there. No trace of him was ever found, no body ever discovered, and his story went cold. Is he sleeping with the fishes, or did he return to pull strings from the shadows? Or maybe he pulled a Saul Goodman and started managing a Cinnabon in Omaha, living life on the lam. Man, that's 2 Breaking Bad references in one point. I gotta spread them out a little bit more. We got lots more than awkwardly wedging in Breaking Bad references on Top 5 Scary. We've got the best horror content on the web at least twice a day, every day, so hit subscribe and stay spooked.
In at number 4, the Honolulu Strangler. The Honolulu Strangler, who is also known as the Honolulu Rapist, was Hawaii's first known serial killer. He killed 5 women between 1985 and 1986. To this day, the killer has not been identified. As the killings went on, the police established a 27-person task force with help from the FBI. There was one person in particular who the police believed was responsible for this act, but with no witnesses willing to come forward, the police were forced to let him go.
Number 3. D.B. Cooper. Now, our next entry, I would hesitate to call him as evil as the rest of some of these crooks, you know? Sure, he hijacked a plane, sure, he held the entire plane hostage, and sure, he stole $200,000 from the government, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. D.B. Cooper's case is one of contemporary crime legends, as all that I just described sounds like he would be FBI public enemy number 1, right? Like they'd be working around the clock to bust this guy, they'd have him within the week. He slipped through authorities' fingers, and to date, D.B. Cooper was never caught. We don't know if that was even his real name, or just an epithet he was using for the plane. We don't know anything really too concrete about him. Depending on what your definition of success is, D.B. Cooper could possibly be considered one of the most successful criminals of all time. To get into the nitty-gritty of the details, on November 24th, 1971, a man using the possible alias Dan Cooper boarded a flight to Seattle, and almost as soon as it took off, he passed a note to a flight attendant indicating that he had a with him, and that he demanded that when the plane landed, he trade the passengers on the flight for $200,000 and 2 parachutes. That's a smart man. He didn't want to waste any of that money on parachutes. The note said that if anything funny happened, he would blow the plane up. They complied out of fear, and upon landing, he was given the money by local authorities. Cooper then seized the plane one more time, holding the flight crew hostage with plans to fly to Mexico City. But midway through the flight, Cooper pulled a little point break and jumped out of the plane with all the money with him. And that would be the last time anyone would have ever seen D.B. Cooper. The FBI chased him for years to no avail. Nothing was ever found. No body ever recovered. No suspect ever caught out of a laundry list of people of interest. Some of the bills were recovered, but that's the only piece of evidence. Now, my absolute favorite theory about D.B. Cooper, and it's kinda out there, is that he's legendary cinema director Tommy Wiseau, and that this is where his fortune came from, as the man is shrouded in mystery regarding where his seemingly limitless supply of money comes from and his mysterious origins. Is it completely ridiculous and has no basis in reality? Yes, but it's also hilarious. Now, as for any more likely suspects for Cooper, there were a couple of Special Forces veterans who lined up with physical descriptions who could have been capable of committing the heist, but no concrete charges were ever made, and to date, no trace was ever found. Number 2, the Zodiac. Possibly one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Zodiac was a notorious criminal, famed in equal measures for his slayings and for his chilling obsession and interaction with the police trying to track him. He was made a household name after a Hollywood flick starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. depicting the efforts trying to find him. The Zodiac is known to be responsible for 5 different deaths terrorizing California in the late 60s and early 70s, although he himself claims responsibility for 37 victims. The Zodiac case became legend when he sent his now infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, providing details only he could have known about the crimes, and challenging the police to a sick game of sorts, sending them incomprehensible ciphers and riddles that supposedly contain clues to his identity and the crimes within. Only one of his ciphers was ever solved, and the rest remain a mystery. The Riddler from the new Batman movie is a direct inspiration from the Zodiac's sinister dealings. For 5 years, the Zodiac would taunt his pursuers with riddles and codes, sending horrifying cards, taunts, a letter boldly displaying "My name is blank," and then a cipher below it teasing their inability to find him. A postcard with his symbol written in blood, amongst others. Part of what makes the Zodiac such a fascinating and truly horrifying case is how much he seems like a movie bad guy come to life. The planning makes him out to be some sort of sinister criminal mastermind, and it's hard to disagree with that proclamation when he's completely eluded any form of capture for the better part of 50 years. There were several possible suspects as to who the Zodiac could have been, but nothing conclusive. To date, people are still trying to find the answer, hoping something new might come up to put that nightmare to rest. Number 1. Jack the Ripper. If you want to talk about evil that's got some staying power, it's hard to top Whitechapel's most infamous resident ever, 134 years avoiding capture, which means he could still be out there. The 18th century Night Stalker has held an almost supernatural-like grip over public interest since we first ever heard about the case, surrounding the brutal 5 slayings we know about, who knows how many more. Preying on women and using the cover of the night, Jack eluded, stupefied, and taunted the streets of London, leaving a disgusting trail of blood and gore in his wake, leaving victims looking like the aftermath of a butcher's. He seemed to take a sickening glee in his violent delights, mocking his would-be pursuers, sending the police threatening letters and even organs from his crimes. Jack is an almost modern mythical boogeyman, appearing across hundreds upon hundreds of works of fiction, TV shows, movies, video games, you name it. Assassin's Creed even tried to say he was part of the Order. That's a little out there. There are some folk who offer that Jack the Ripper is the progenitor to all true crime fascination, which honestly kind of makes sense. As much as he terrified Londoners at the time, the media was obsessed with him, with the original media buzz surrounding him, paralleling how we talk about most brutal crimes these days. You can bet your bottom pounds that if Jack was terrorizing London today, there'd be podcasters talking about him in between sponsored ads for MeUndies. Jack's crimes shocked Londoners, as the vicious and public nature of the slayings were not exactly commonplace. So surely, in 130 years, someone had to have some idea as to who Mr. the Ripper was, right? Well, with a case as famous as this, obviously there are some options. A quick glance at Jack's Wikipedia page suggests a possible 31 different suspects over the years who've all been attributed to it, and those are just the ones who made the page. It's worth noting that we are still looking, we are still trying to find him, put this case to rest, because everyone wants to be the one to say they unmasked the Ripper.
Coming in at number 5, the Sodder Children. In West Virginia, 1945, 5 of the Sodder children disappeared on Christmas Eve night. On this night, 5 of the 10 siblings asked if they could stay up late to play with their toys. Since it was Christmas Eve, the parents agreed and let the kids stay up, and they went off to bed. Soon after the parents went to bed, the phone rang. The children's mother got up to answer it. The voice on the other end asked for someone who didn't live there, so the mother said no. And then the voice on the other end laughed and hung up. She woke up briefly again after hearing something on the roof. And then one final time at 1:30 a.m. with the realization that the house was on fire. She, her husband, and their other 5 children got out. But the 5 children who were staying up late were nowhere to be found. So the father went to grab a ladder that he kept at the side of the house so he could climb up to their bedroom window on the 2nd floor. But he couldn't find the ladder. It was later found dragged away from the house. The mother later realized that at the time of the fire, all of the lights in the house were on, the shades were drawn, and the doors were locked. Officials said that the children died in the fire, but the Sodders knew something weird happened that night. They knew their children were still alive. Then in the 60s, they had a photo mailed to them with the message, "Hi Mom," attached. In this photo, they could see one of their sons who disappeared on that Christmas Eve night as a grown adult. The parents knew their children were kidnapped, but they or the perpetrator have not been identified since.
Number 4, the Pickler. You know, at first glance, This is not a particularly threatening nickname. It kind of sounds like the absolute lamest Z-tier excuse for a Batman villain that you'd throw in as a warm-up before, fighting the actual cool villain of that issue. Well, names can often be so deceiving because there really is not a lot that's funny about the Pickler once you understand why they called him that. He's maybe one of the most bizarre and macabre criminals I've ever read about. The Hungarian Bela Kiss lived in a small village near Budapest in the early 20th century. He lived with an elderly maid, but otherwise kept to himself. Didn't have a tight circle of friends, but he did enjoy frequent female company. I mean, of course, with a name like Bela Kiss. Makes sense. I gotta stop trying to make this guy sound cute because I'm gonna regret it in like 1 second. In 1914, during the height of the First World War, Bela left to fight with his country. Now, wartime sometimes necessitates borrowing resources wherever you can, and the Hungarian army was short on gas. On Bela's isolated property were dozens upon dozens of oil barrels all conspicuously laid out in his yard. Someone alerted the soldiers and they went to go borrow a cup or two, and were shocked to discover that upon cracking open the barrels were the bodies of several women floating in alcohol in a depraved attempt to preserve the corpses. Hence where the foul nickname the Pickler came from. See, it's not nearly as funny once you know why they call him that. 20 barrels, 20 missing women. That's somehow not even the scariest, craziest part of this whole story. The women had punctures in their necks and were drained of blood, which sounds completely made up that this guy might also have been a vampire. Now, the Hungarian army moved to seize Bela immediately, but tracking him proved rather difficult, as he had a fairly common name and was also, he was in a war. Somehow, Bela was alerted that police had discovered his operation, and he left a corpse posing as himself in a military hospital and fled, never to be found again. Reported sightings popped up for a few years here and there. Allegedly, he moved to New York to begin a new life, but Bela eluded capture for the rest of his life. Unless he really was a vampire and is still out there, but I don't even want to entertain that possibility.
At number 3, the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer had a total of 5 confirmed murders, but it's expected that he killed an additional 20 to 28 people and wounded 2 others. All these murders took place in the San Francisco Bay Area between the late 1960s and the early 1970s. The killer's identity is still unknown to this day. All of these killings, and yet no one has been charged for them. Once the murders began, the killer started to taunt the police and the local paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, by sending them a total of 4 letters. They all contained these encrypted messages, which were pretty much impossible to crack. Out of all these messages, only one has ever been deciphered. And while these letters were taunting, they did contain a number of leads. In fact, for a while, a man named Arthur Lee Allen was the name on the top of the suspect list. However, handwriting experts were unable to match his handwriting to the cipher or various letters. Over the years, people have come forward claiming to know the killer's true identity, but so far nothing has been proven through the court. So this man just got away with all these killings and then disappeared into the night. Coming in at number 2, D.B. Cooper. To this day, no one even knows this person's real name. But on November 24th of 1971, this name was all over America. This was the day the man claiming to be Dan Cooper boarded flight number 305 in Portland bound for Seattle. While mid-flight, he opened his briefcase to show a bomb he was carrying to a flight attendant. Yeah, back then security checks weren't as intense, so you could get a bomb on a plane. He proceeded to hijack the plane and gave the go-ahead for it to land in Seattle. Once on the ground, he let the 36 passengers go, demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and food. He also said that the rear door was to remain open and for the plane to fly low and slow. Once he got everything he asked for, he, along with the flight attendant and the pilots, took off from the Seattle airport with these marked bills. 45 minutes into the flight, somewhere north of Portland, he exited the rear stairs and jumped out of the plane and into the night. Law enforcement officials did have 5 different planes tailing the jetliner, but apparently not one of these planes witnessed the jump. Hundreds of people were interviewed, the FBI tracked leads across the nation, and the aircraft itself was scoured for evidence. But in the end, it was no use. D.B. Cooper was gone. 9 years later in 1980, just north of Portland, a young man was digging a fire pit, and he uncovered 3 bundles of cash. He turned them over to the authorities, and they discovered these serial numbers matched the bills that were given to Cooper. Still to this day, no one knows this man's true identity or what happened to him, and it remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in FBI history. However, earlier this year, some people claimed that D.B. Cooper was actually a former CIA operative named Robert Rackstraw, and Robert just so happens to be alive and well living in California, but at this point he hasn't been charged with anything. And in at number 1, Tara Calico. On September 20th, 1988 in New Mexico, 19-year-old Tara was off on one of her daily bike rides, only this time she never came back. It's widely believed that she was kidnapped. When she hadn't returned, Tara's mother set off to look for her along her normal trail, but all she found was pieces of Tara's Walkman and a cassette tape. Several people also said that they saw Tara on her bike ride that day, but no one witnessed her abduction. But some people did say that they noticed a light-colored pickup truck was following her. Months later, on June 15, 1989, a Polaroid of a young woman and a boy being gagged and bound was found in a convenience store parking lot in Florida. Tara's mom thought that the woman in this photo was Tara due to her appearance, and the fact the woman in the picture had an identical scar on her leg as Tara did. After this, more photos seem to have surfaced of a female bound and gagged, but these photos have not been released to the public. The female in these photos was again suspected to be Tara, but the little boy in the photos remains unidentified. Later, these photos were analyzed by Scotland Yard, and they concluded the woman was indeed Tara. The FBI then analyzed the photos, but their results were inconclusive. Then in October of 2013, a 6-person task force was established to reinvestigate the case. But as of 2018, no arrests have been made and the case remains open. Starting in our number 5 spot, Frank, John, and Clarence. If you're familiar with stories from Alcatraz prison, then these names probably ring a bell. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were prisoners at San Francisco's Alcatraz maximum security prison. This prison was home to some of the most dangerous criminals, and it was said to be impossible to escape. Well, believe it or not, these men managed to break free. Morris, along with the Anglin brothers, plotted their daring escape for years before they actually carried out their plan on June 11, 1962. They crawled through air vents to reach the prison's roof, and then they shimmied down a large smokestack, and then once they were on the ground, they ran to the shoreline and they never looked back. What happened to the men beyond this point is a mystery. The guards of the prison like to say that the men drowned in the swirling currents of the San Francisco Bay before they were able to reach freedom. A manhunt was set into place, but the bodies were never found. On top of that, FBI investigations did conclude that even though the water was cold and the currents were strong, it was theoretically possible for one or more of the inmates to make it to land. Since the escaped family members of the inmates have claimed to have received phone calls and Christmas cards from these men on the run, very much implying that they are alive. In 2018, the FBI confirmed the existence of a letter allegedly written by escapee John Anglin, and this forced them to reopen the investigation into the case. The letter was received by the San Francisco Police Department in 2013. The start of the letter says, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter goes on to say how Frank died in 2008 and Clarence died 3 years later in 2011. And at number 4, Evelyn Hurley. The disappearance of Evelyn happened in Wisconsin in 1953, and it's pretty much straight out of a horror movie. Evelyn was a teen and she was babysitting for a family one evening. When she didn't call to check in with the parents at the appointed time, they got worried, so the father went to check up on her and found a completely locked house with the lights and radio still on. But Evelyn was nowhere to be found. There were signs of forced entry and struggle, and this led to a massive search for the girl, but she's never been found. After her disappearance, there were a few eyewitnesses who have claimed to have seen her, but all of these leads were dead ends. At number 3, the Doodler. The Doodler is an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for 14 murders and 3 assaults between January 1974 and September 1975. His attacks took place in San Francisco, and his victims were always men in the gay community. He would meet his victims at nightclubs or in other gay-friendly hotspots in the city. 3 of his victims survived. But since helping the investigation would out them essentially to the public, they chose not to testify against a suspect in court. But they did give a detailed description of the killer to the police, and this is the composite sketch that they came up with. The killer's name, the Doodler, was given to him because he had a habit of sketching his victims prior to killing them. Something that also linked the killings was his consistent method, where he would stab the victims in the front and the back of their bodies. Even though so many years have passed, this case is currently still open and ongoing in the San Francisco Police Department. And at number 2, Jack the Ripper. Over a century ago, London's most notorious serial killer roamed the East End. His main prey were prostitutes, and he killed at least 5 women that we know of. This neighborhood set into panic as these bodies were found within a 3-month period of each other in 1888, all within a mile of each other. Newspapers listed these killings as barbaric and too horrible to even describe. but basically all of the victims had their throats slashed, and most of them had their stomachs slit and organs ripped out before the body was dumped on the street. His motive is still unknown. The FBI took a special interest in the case in 1988 at a request of a movie production company. Even with everyone in law enforcement looking into the case, the police were never able to put a face to the killer. The FBI noted that had we had the current technology we have today back then, then it would have been possible to catch this person. One really key fact about this killer is the notes he left behind. The National Archives obtained letters exchanged between different law enforcement bosses in 1888, when all of these murders were first happening. The killer sent these letters to the London Metropolitan Police Service to taunt them and suggest that more murders were coming. Over the years, many people have speculated the identity of Jack the Ripper, but no one was ever prosecuted, so it looks like he took the secret to his grave. This makes him one of England's most famous unsolved mysteries, and one of the world's most infamous criminals. There was only one person to ever come close to naming the culprit, and that was author Russell Edwards, who in 2014 claimed he could prove the identity of Jack the Ripper based on DNA from a shawl that belonged to one of the female victims. The DNA points to Aaron Kosmicki, who was a Polish immigrant, and actually one of the prime suspects of the gruesome murders, but again to this day nothing has been verified. And in at number 1, the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer has a total of 5 confirmed murders, but it's expected that he killed an additional 20 to 28 people, and he wounded 2 others. All of these murders took place in the San Francisco Bay Area between the late 1960s and early 1970s. This killer's identity is still unknown to this day. All of these killings, and yet no one has been charged for them. Once the murders began, the killer started to taunt the police and the local paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, by sending them a total of 4 letters. They all contain these encrypted messages which were pretty much impossible to crack. Out of all of these messages, only one has ever been deciphered. And while these letters were taunting, they did contain a number of leads. In fact, for a while, a man named Arthur Lee Allen was the name on the top of the suspect list. However, handwriting experts were unable to match his handwriting to the cipher or various letters. Over the years, people have come forward claiming to know the killer's true identity, but so far nothing has been proven through the court. So this man just got away with these killings and then disappeared into the night.